learned that Pope Francis had passed. And I once heard him tell a story, a parable, over lunch. And he started by observing that since we were in Italy, we would have wine at lunch. Wine at lunch here in Fredericton? We don't have wine at lunch. We banned it. We banned it in Ottawa. David, if you get to Ottawa, no wine at lunch. But he said he was in Italy, so we're going to have wine at lunch. And he observed that wine is many things. It has a bouquet, it has a smell, it has a color, it has a richness of taste, all of which complements the food. It has alcohol, which enlivens the mind, shall we say. So wine enriches, his point, wine enriches all of our senses. And at the end of the meal, again, being Italy, we're scheduled to have grappa. Grappa is one thing, it's alcohol. Grappa is wine distilled. And so then he goes on and he says, humanity is many things. We are passionate, we are curious, we are rational, we are generous, we are self-interested. The market is one thing, self-interested. The market is humanity distilled. Yeah. And then he called on us and he said, your job is to turn the grappa back into wine, to turn the market back into humanity. It was a very important message.
Okay, first I'll talk about the point that Marcus Cocktail is making and resists the urge to dig into my thoughts on the Vatican. So it's interesting to see Carney is speaking through metaphor. And one of the great things about metaphor is that, like with phrases such as the middle class, that term means very different things to different people. Almost everyone, no matter how poor or rich, sees themselves as middle class, unless they're taking baths in money. Honestly, I feel like even Scrooge McDuck would see himself as middle class. And I'm not going to argue about what the term actually means. Maybe I'll do a video about that another day. Honestly, I'd be very interested in hearing what you hear when you hear that story, because to me, this lands firmly in democratic socialist territory. But I don't think that's where Mark Carney lands on the political spectrum. He's free to prove me wrong. Like, there are definitely things I find appealing about him. At the bare minimum, you have to admit that he's a very good public speaker, at least in terms of content. I know a conservative person who loves to complain about when he goes etc. But like, those are thinky noises, and it is very hard to read even from a script without making those. And realistically, if somebody's not demonstrating that they're thinking, there's a good chance that they are just going from slogan to slogan and what they're saying doesn't mean anything to them. But is Mark Carney a democratic socialist? I don't think so. And I think part of that is that he is more than aware that if Bernie had ever been the Democratic nominee, he probably wouldn't have made it to election day, because power protects power, money protects money, and people with skills are cheap in the grand scheme of things. Part of me feels like I should actually read his book. Part of me also feels like I should vacuum my living room. Instead, I'm writing the script, and I tend to write scripts for videos more than I do other things that maybe I should. The general impression that I get from Mark Carney is that he understands that capitalism left to itself eats itself, which I think is a pretty central understanding in democratic socialism. But I get that sense that his approach is, rather than directly going to war with the capitalists, who are conditioned to strive for money and ignore the human cost of their callousness, his strategy is to set boundaries that restrict them from being their worst selves, by essentially structuring things in a way that they make more money by causing less harm. And I am so conflicted on this approach. To be clear, in this election, I think he's by far the best party leader to push Canada forward. And while I very much normally favor minority governments because they tend to actually get more done and are also much more difficult for the wealthy to exploit/bribe, I think in the short term, if Carney can keep the Liberals from getting embroiled in any big scandals, a majority government is capable of moving faster and more intentionally. But this is one of the problems with manufactured chaos. The rich, hashtag not all the rich, but a lot of the rich, tend to both create problems and capitalize on problems to gain more power or influence. For example, while many wealthy people may be very frustrated about the recent shenanigans with the stock market, we've also had reports that a number of people may have been tipped off to when they could buy the dips and then when things would come back. And I'll be honest, I've been very tempted to reinvest my meager TFSA, while a certain typically high-performing stock is lower than it was when I sold all the shares that I did own. But at the same time, I don't know what is going to happen in the future. So for now, I'm staying out of the market because we're in month 3, and I don't think that he's done shitting in the stock box. Honestly, right now might be a brilliant time for Canada to have an economist as PM. As long as we can fend off America from outright attacking us, if Canada can stay stable, we could get a ton of investment of capital in Canada. But here is the thing, capital always wants a return on investment. And you can argue that money that isn't tied to anything is actually infinite and thus meaningless. That is right. Countless horrible things are done every day as humanity seeks to earn more of an abstract concept, which was historically attributed to items that could be exchanged for things of actual value, but now it's not even items that we're exchanging, it is largely simply values in heavily regulated databases. Suddenly it makes exchanging labor for reach and followers seem more rational than it did a few seconds ago, though doing it on a platform that might outright ban you at the drop of a hat while most of your followers still haven't even bothered to follow you anywhere else does seem a little bit silly on my part. Anyway, the question I'd love to ask Marcus is what he considers a success. And someone might suggest I read his book, but really, if success for him is something that he feels comfortable putting in a book, then it's really just a half measure. Because it probably won't go far enough. But that is my perspective as someone with too much experience with malignant narcissists. I have my doubts that I could go to a place like Davos and not just scream at the people around me for the amount of harm that they cause while seeing themselves as not harmful at all. It's worth noting that not every rich person is necessarily a narcissist, or more specifically, a malignant narcissist, but there is a constant undercurrent in wealthy circles. Narcissistic behavior is not just considered normal, but it's also considered socially acceptable. And to not behave in a selfish and narcissistic manner is countercultural to the subculture of the rich. And there's this idea that you can spend your way out of other people's desire to profit from destruction. And then you can also make your money back somehow. Now, you can argue that in a capitalist framework, if your side is constantly losing money, you eventually weaken yourself to the point where you are vulnerable to those who have been building their wealth while attacking what you're working on. And so I understand that perspective. And actually, now that I say that, it makes sense that he would then want to try and become the leader of a country where he could institute laws that rewrite the rules around how capitalism functions within at least the confines of that country. And I'm fully aware that I may be talking myself into imagining that he's smarter than he is. We'll probably get to see. The big question will be what changes does he push for within the next 4 years? Because he's been talking about grand, big swings, etc., etc. But how much does he understand that in order to get a country to where the most vulnerable are taken care of and where there's as little suffering as possible, you have to make radical changes to what it means to be a company, not just to the government. There's a great documentary that I watched back in college called The Corporation, which basically makes the point that legally, at least in the US, companies are legally required to function as sociopaths. And the thing to remember is that in Canada, while we may have things like labor laws and some things that protect us from being as bad as they are in America, most of our companies seem to function very similarly to how they do in the US. And they also have the same goals, and they also want to make Canada American, particularly the way that their health insurance companies keep pumping money into Canada to try and sabotage our system that works when it's governed properly. I did see one company whose products I use called the Unscented Company states that they are a certified B company, which apparently means that they're focused on doing good in the world. But I just looked into it, and near as I can tell, this is not a government classification. So the question is, if you do tweak things so that private capital is incentivized to do the right thing, how do you cause lasting change after 4 years? Because that's what you get. You might get another 4 years, but we like to change the curtains for no reason sometimes. And there's also a chance that you may make a mistake that ends up being a big reason. And if you don't move fast enough, Canadians are very likely to immediately afterwards elect an idiot who sells off any social housing that's built, sells off any crown corporations, and then we're just back to being discount America with maybe we still have healthcare. Like, in order for this to work, from my perspective, you need to both have things in place that are appealing enough that the wealthy don't revolt, because the wealthy are often very revolting. And then you need to enact things in law that are somehow simple enough that so that even in heavily conservative leaning areas, particularly rural areas, how do you make it so that something is so clearly agreeable in the same way that healthcare is, that it becomes part of their identity of what it means to be Canadian. It's worth noting that both Drunk Ford and Daniel Sith are both actively driving up healthcare costs while sabotaging their public systems. So, like, even that aspect of Canadian identity can be comfortably attacked by conservatives if you just make them afraid that teachers are going to turn their sons into daughters. So I don't know. There's certainly an argument that can be made for attempting this reverse miracle. And the general battle cry of neoliberals is everything can be better with incremental change. I don't know where you even begin. Obviously, they're planning on tackling housing and using that to inject capital into the Canadian economy while also catalyzing jobs in the trades. So, like, they have some very good ideas, but there is so much money to be made through dishonest means. And do the Liberals have the will to regulate, for example, Gulf Stream media? Because sure, you don't want to attack the press, but allowing lobbyist groups to put huge amounts of money into groups that legally will be like, no, we're not the news, but then to their audience will be like, hey, we're the news. It's like allowing someone to go around to schools and hand out books to students just off school grounds that have completely alternate versions of history. And it's not clear that they're novels. They're literally poisoning Canadians' abilities to think rationally, and it's not okay. And it's not free speech, it's bought speech. And so, like, if they want to have all these crackpot theories while only being paid, small amounts by other crackpots, sure. But in most cases, these voices are being amplified by people who think that the more Canadians are clueless about what's actually going on around them, the easier time that they'll have getting their friends elected. And I think we need to take meaningful steps to not just rein that in, but like wipe it out. I won't go into ideas for how to do it, but like there's ways that I can think of how to do it. But I don't know if anyone has the political will to do that. And to be clear, I am not the news. I am comedy, I am political commentary, but I am not the news. I am not a journalist. If you think of me as a journalist, you need to bookmark the CBC's website and read some actual news from actual journalists sometimes. Please, please do that. At best, I am the discount Canadian knockoff of The Daily Show in much smaller chunks. Back to the metaphor, it's lovely, but it would also be a miracle. Because while capitalism that we have may be a distilled beverage, the best way to remove alcohol from a liquid like that is heat. Not enough to boil the water out, but enough to evaporate the alcohol, which has a lower boiling point, which would be good, since I don't think Canada's liver can handle this much capitalism for much longer. But at the end of the day, my MCS means that I can't actually drink wine. So I would much prefer a glass of fresh spring water, and if we want to have a good time, there's a certain type of fungus from BC that we could legalize.